and making it available for public use. This was a reaction to the federal anti-discrimination laws that applied to both public and private property. The idea that federal law would apply to private property is not a new concept, as laws apply to everywhere in the nation, especially violence, sexual assault, fraud, etc. The Civil Rights Bill adds another crime to the list of things people cannot do on their private property. Wallace also opposed the idea that no prayers or mention of God can be made in public schools. The belief in a God, which from all good things originated, is not a religion, according to Wallace. Getting back to Richard Nixon, when he assumed office of the presidency in January 1969, the U.S. had suffered more than 48,000 men killed in action. Nixon stated 31,000 KIAs. Nixon believed that he would conclude America's involvement in the Vietnam conflict within a year. But it took 4 years in actuality. What happened during those 4 long years? Well, in order to demonstrate his toughness, Nixon ordered an increase of military activity and secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia during the early months of his term. The North Vietnamese had begun using areas in Cambodia to establish base camps and enable the transit of supplies and men. In June 1968, Richard Nixon met with President Thieu at Midway to discuss the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam. From that point forward, the U.S. began to withdraw forces. Public negotiations were mere theater, and serious discussions would take place in private. Nixon wanted to deliver a number of short, sharp blows to coerce the North Vietnamese into negotiations, but the idea never progressed beyond the planning phase. Having failed by the end of 1969 to make progress in negotiations, Nixon delivered a speech to buy time for a protracted conflict, invoking the silent majority. In his speech, Richard Nixon claimed that the unilateral withdrawal of U.S. forces would be a disaster for the United States. He claimed that there would be massacres of South Vietnamese, using the North Vietnamese clubbing and shooting of civilians in Hue. He pointed to the need to protect Catholic refugees. For the U.S., Nixon claimed that defeat and humiliation in South Vietnam would cause allies to lose confidence. It would encourage our enemies in the Middle East, Europe, and eventually the West. Ultimately, Nixon claimed that a precipitous withdrawal from Vietnam would cost more lives and would not bring peace. The North Vietnamese were holding out for the U.S. to surrender before negotiations would begin, terms that Nixon would not accept. In conclusion, by 1969, the North Vietnamese were in a strong position to win the peace, and thus were negotiating on their terms. Nixon incorrectly assessed the situation and thought that the U.S. could win the peace after being defeated in the war. In 1970, Richard Nixon authorized U.S. troops to move into a 30-kilometer strip over the border into Cambodia to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines and supply bases. This set back the North Vietnamese, giving time for the Vietnamization of the conflict. In spring 1971, the U.S. launched a major offensive. This was combined by a diplomatic effort to weaken China and Russian support for the North Vietnamese. This failed. In 1972, negotiations failed to bring about terms that South Vietnam would accept. Finally, in January 1973, Richard Nixon ended America's involvement in the Vietnam conflict following an extensive bombing campaign of North Vietnam in 1972, known as Linebacker II. This was the heaviest bombing campaign since World War II, and its goal was to target major complexes in Hanoi and Hao Phang to bring the North Vietnamese back to the bargaining table. The Nixon administration applied pressure on South Vietnamese President Thieu to accept the peace deal negotiated in January 1973. The president had misgivings that the North Vietnamese would honor the agreement, which Nixon addressed by providing personal assurances that the U.S. would support the South Vietnamese should the North violate the agreement. Upon U.S. withdrawal of troops, neither side abided by the peace treaty, and the war continued in Vietnam until 1975, concluding with the fall of Saigon. Nixon never supported the South Vietnamese as promised due to reluctance of Congress to re-enter the war and the Watergate scandal. In conclusion, rhetoric and the fear of the spread of communism propelled 4 U.S. presidents foolishly to engage in Southeast Asia. The war was conducted without the declaration of war, which is an overreach of power of the executive branch of government according to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, which states, Congress shall have power to declare war, grant letters of marque, and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. A significant amount of distrust is created when a series of 4 elected presidents in the executive branch commit U.S. forces into a conflict that spans 3 decades without a congressional declaration of war. There's a check and balance that is missing that our framers intended to be in place to prevent catastrophes just like the Vietnam conflict. LBJ left office with the U.S. in a weak position, begging for a peace agreement to save face. Sensing complete victory, the North Vietnamese would have nothing of it. LBJ left the conflict in a shambles for his replacement, and his failure was complete. Nixon ignored the will of the American people and carried on the war for an additional 4 years based upon his false beliefs, costing an additional 9,414 deaths. Richard Nixon's assertion that he had a secret plan was false. The U.S. ultimately proved to be a weak ally, especially when compared to the Chinese and Russians. This makes sense when thinking about the existential threat presented to the Chinese mainland in the form of a strongly U.S.-allied Vietnam. The lesson bears significance today as we think about Taiwan and the Korean Peninsula, both considered of existential importance to China. Following the Vietnam conflict, Americans have become more suspicious of the executive branch and its war powers, and the commitment of U.S. forces without a congressional declaration of war. There would be little to separate executive war powers from that of a dictatorship without congressional oversight. To sum up this episode, we walked through the Credit Mobilier Railroad scam that involved the Speaker of the House who eventually became Vice President. We also reviewed the Teapot Dome scandal, in which a member of the President's cabinet engaged in corruption by selling oil land leases through an illegal insider process for his private benefit. We then discussed the crisis of the Vietnam conflict, which involved 4 presidents and the deaths of almost 58,000 members of the U.S. Armed Forces and an estimated 200 to 250,000 South Vietnamese, all conducted without a congressional declaration of war. President Eisenhower did not trust the people of Vietnam to decide their own fate through an election in 1956, fearing that communism would win. JFK began the involvement of the U.S. in order to look tougher on communism domestically. His successor, LBJ, further escalated the war, but ultimately admitted defeat and withdrew early from the presidential election of 1968. Richard Nixon misled the American people by continuing the conflict for another 4 years after his election and escalating it through offensives and bombing campaigns instead of withdrawing the U.S. swiftly. Getting back to the story that precipitated this review of our history of government distrust in the U.S., namely the January 6th protest and ultimate storming of the Capitol, it seems that there is plenty of justification for the public to suspect manipulation of elections based upon the misdeeds of our leaders in the past. Before coming to any final conclusions, we will continue our investigation by taking a detailed look at the assassination of an American president, the FBI, CIA, IRS, and even the Post Office in my next episode. Those government agencies violated the Constitution, the liberties of American citizens, and at least one agency even went so far as to disobey the direct orders of a sitting U.S. president.